Do I just click and then it just changes the slideshow?
Yeah, I had to click on the bottom corner on the arrow, but you might be fine.
Move that down the bottom.
No, if you need that, well, then you
You can choose that one now. Okay, hi, I'm going to be presenting on the mind and the body with reference to Jane Austen's Persuasion. The mind and body are fascinating concepts to investigate, both generally and in terms of 19th century literature. Firstly, there are expectations for young women. They must be virtuous, dutiful, and continuously occupy with a handicraft of some form. Society very much endorsed these behaviours, and some even produced conduct manuals to show how they expect people to behave. In this presentation, we'll attempt to demonstrate the ways in which both entities were perceived and the links between them. Okay, firstly, the mind is a very complex and interesting facility. It's not purely the cognitive aspect that needs to be examined in relation to Austen's novel, i.e. our thought processes. It's the emotional and physical responses that occur after. Building upon Freud's work on the unconscious mind, this picture of Freud just there, it may be argued that a focus on both the conscious and the unconscious needs to be examined in order to create a realistic impression of a situation. I'm not necessarily referring to the minds of Austen's characters in Persuasion, but her effect upon her readers. Commenting on a study conducted at the Stanford Center for Cognitive and Neurobiological Imaging in California, Susan Celia Greenfield, who is an associate professor of English at Fordham University, advises that there is a link between the mind and emotion, and not only that, she suggests that the body thinks differently to the mind, which is completely contrary to the 19th century belief that the mind and the body work together, and that by instructing the mind and consciously instructing the body to behave in a certain way was beneficial to a person. This study confirms the 19th century belief that reading would have an effect upon the mind. For a woman to gain an education which could be obtained by books was believed to make them unfit for domestic purposes. The study on the brainwaves of students confirms that Austen's novels are mentally stimulating, and this can be seen in a number of sections within Persuasion. So in this respect, the view that novels with some ultra mind is correct. This study confirms the kind of influence, but whether it's beneficial or not is actually unclear. The reader is therefore involved in the text and arguably also participates in the working of the novel. Upon reading Captain Frederick Wentworth's letter to Anne Elliot, one cannot help but feel that the letter is actually addressed to themselves. His use of you assists in this idea. He is conveying his heartfelt sentiments to Anne and the reader, and because the novel has arguably trained the reader to think in this manner, by the time that the letter is produced, one can feel Anne's astonishment, her excitement and happiness, and her sense of having been forgiven for refusing him all of those years ago. If the theory of this study is correct, if the theory of this study is correct, according to the placement of the reader within the text, we have to follow the thoughts of Anne Elliot, but at the same time, not be insensible to the agitation of Captain Wentworth and his own emotional torment. This places the reader in a privileged yet peculiar position, where they are both inside and outside of the novel. As the study points out, the reader sees the novel from a third-person perspective, but in order to fully understand the character's thoughts and emotions, they must ultimately empathise with the protagonist of the novel, and one way to do this is to effectively become the character, feeling their emotions and thinking their thoughts, while simultaneously acknowledging other characters within the novel. The study also suggests that the mind and the body work in separate spheres. Susan Celia Greenfield explains that not only does close reading create a distinctly different blood flow pattern in the brain, but it also activates diverse regions that stretch far beyond those associated with attention. In one example, even reaching into areas generally dedicated to physical activity. You may think you are sitting still with a book, your brain does not. This may be interpreted as an explanation for escapism and the way in which your mind is physically excited by imagination. This suggests that the mind and the body work as two separate entities. However, if we consider these two concepts in terms of Freudian psychology, which arguably is essential to the undercurrent of Persuasion, then we see that this structure is more complex than we think. We must acknowledge the workings of the mind and the body of the reader, whilst they are trying to concentrate on the text and gain a greater understanding. And we must also think about what is going on in the novel and what the characters are thinking and feeling. Greenfield explains that the MRI represents the Austen reader's consciousness as the reader thinks about Austen's representation of the character's consciousness. Therefore, the reader has to somewhat detach themselves from reality and immerse themselves within Persuasion in order to fully comprehend and experience the realist perspective that Austen offers in her distinctive writing style. We may explore the reader's response to reading the text and their ability to both sympathise and empathise with Austen's characters. However, we should not be neglectful of the various examples within Persuasion where characters' minds and bodies are somehow conjoined. For example, Wentworth and Anne are so aware of each other that just a look is enough to convey their thoughts and feelings. This telepathy as to an idea of the object of consciousness that I shall discuss in more detail a bit later on. It's easy for a reader to make a connection between the spinster Anne Elliot and Jane Austen herself. However, it's also been suggested that Austen is in fact seen in the character of Captain Frederick Wentworth. Kay Young, in Feeling Embodied, Consciousness, Persuasion and Jane Austen, explains the urgency that Austen would have felt being so close to death, and links this with Wentworth's need to declare his feelings to Anne without reflecting on past experience. This is another instance of art mirroring life, and again, that Anne's spinsterhood may be akin to Jane Austen's real-life experience. Aristotle's theory of mimesis explained the idea of this imitation, and although it's unclear whether Austen had access to Aristotle's precepts, the theme of Aristotelian happiness may be found in all of her novels. She also discusses the idea that Anne Elliot is actually a being without a body. Her loss of youth results in a loss of esteem of her character by other characters, such as Sir Walter and her sister Elizabeth. This seems to suggest that the physicality of a character is measured by their acknowledgement by others. However, it may be argued that it's her good nature and heart that endear her as a character to others, such as Captain Bennet and Captain Harville. It's the control of her faculties, her nerves and her emotions that make her both a desirable woman and arguably an unnatural one. Another point to mention is the way in which we view the physicality of other characters. Elizabeth and Walter Elliot seem haughty to us because we have to trust in the confiding author, and as such we align ourselves again to Anne Elliot, and therefore are more inclined to measure other characters against the gentility and quiet-souled Anne. Anne becomes in a way this meek, humbled figure who does not have too much of the Elliot pride. So the concept of mind and body therefore at times become entwined. We may consider the mindset of characters and the embodiment of emotions. The duality of these components becomes clearer and the realism of the characters in it is enhanced and their consciousness gains clarity. John Caspar Lavater, 1741 to 1801, who's a Swiss poet and physiognomist, explains this concept perfectly in his essays on physiognomy. He wrote that physiognomy is the science or knowledge of the correspondence between the external and the internal man, the visible superficial and its invisible contents. This may be seen in the way that Wentworth is insensible to Anne's true feelings, and the way that Anne internally fears meeting with him in public. It can also be seen in the way that the majority of the characters are insensible to Anne's internal suffering. Kay Young also writes about the way in which character consciousness is created. As I've mentioned earlier, Anne is frequently seen as an aging woman, past her youth and it seems without marriage prospects. Young argues that her consciousness has a relational object, Wentworth. She writes that he holds her in his consciousness, he is the object of her consciousness. She describes Wentworth as the object that prompts her, Anne, to feel her own being and no substitute is possible. Anne's consciousness of herself is diminished until it is reawakened by the renewal of her acquaintance with him. This theory somewhat suggests that her being remains almost comatose throughout the novel, and indeed this may be so, for she is submissive, passive and quiet. It's only the reader's awareness and ability to empathise with her internal feelings that allow us to fully comprehend her character despite the contradiction in her physical behaviour. For example, her willingness to stay at home to look after her nephew after his accident, and her inner torment of Wentworth's physical proximity. This is also where the idea of the telepathy between Anne and Wentworth comes in, although Wentworth is not entirely sure of her feelings and makes this evident in his need to write her a letter to declare his own. The telepathy may be seen in the way that just a look will be enough. Anne's feelings and consciousness of her feelings arguably stem from her own acknowledgement that she should not have been so easily persuaded in the past. The 27-year-old woman is wiser than the 19-year-old girl that she was, and it's interesting that the consciousness of her character now transitions from the control of others to herself. In other words, the physicality of her character that relied upon the acknowledgement of others may exist in its own right. The very term persuasion implies a mind that's been controlled by another, and persuasion therefore is a novel that highlights the importance of thought, the mind, behaviour, and the body and reader engagement. So the aims of this presentation are as follows. To emphasise to you that the body and the external may contradict the mind and the internal. The reader's awareness and ability to empathise with the heroine of the novel are crucial to their understanding of these contradictions and are vital to their emotional engagement with the text. It's to suggest that the concepts of mind and body can be examined in terms of the reader as well as character representation. It's to demonstrate that the consciousness of some characters rely upon the acknowledgement of their character by others, And the semi-biographical element of text may be seen to reflect the author's reality, however this must not be assumed. And then there's my bibliography. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh, well, that's very interesting. I was just thinking about, who was it now? Kay Young's Austen's proximity to death.
Yeah.
Playing the way she's writing Persuasion, she is kind of quite close to death, because
Yeah.
she could die, it's almost
Yeah.
within months of finishing it, but she doesn't know she's going to die.
No.
So, do you buy into this notion?
In somewhat, I think that real life can definitely influence an author, and author presence within a text. You can kind of see things. But as she was unaware, I don't know really. I think it's. I mean, if you look at all of Austen's other novels, like Northanger Abbey and Sensibility, Emma, there's always this massive rush of sentiment towards the end of the novel, and like I said in the presentation about the Aristotelian theory of happiness, I think that it's something that she's very good at, and Austen is very good at anyway, and it's something that she is distinctive to her as an author. But I do see where Kay is coming from in that respect. She's likened the urgency and the need for Wentworth to declare his feelings to Anne to the fear of death and the proximity of that coming up, and people didn't live as long back then. So
Keats knows he's going to die,
yeah.
about 18 months before he actually does, but Austen is still writing comic poems on her deathbed the day before she dies, so she's not kind of coming to terms with things.
Yeah.
She's kind of, even at that last moment, she's kind of fighting with her illness, and still has this kind of creative spark in a fascinating way.
I did do a bit of research, and it was argued that Persuasion was written in a lot more haste towards the end, because Austen was actually, I don't know how true this is, but a lot of people seem to suggest that she was rushing because she knew that she was going to die soon, and she wanted to finish the book before she did. So I don't know how true that is, but there was a few sources there.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I just ask, would you say that your approach to mind and body, was it more historical and contextual and concerned with ideas towards mind and body in Austen's period, or do you think it was more informed by modern cognitive science?
Sorry, yeah, is that the study?
Your approach to the topic, do you think were you more informed by contemporary ideas in Austen's period, or ideas now, or somewhere in between?
It's hard to say, because I really love Austen anyway. I've read all of her novels, so I've always had this feeling for her, and I've looked into it. So, but I do think it's probably more the contemporaries, because I don't think. I mean, I think it would be wrong to say that there wasn't as much popularity for her back then as there is now, because we don't know for sure. But no, I think I do go along with more modern takings on it, because I'm more interested in finding out the new kind of feelings about her work than I still acknowledge what was discussed about her at the time. I do feel that today's society knows, and they've done so much more research, and they've looked at it in further detail, and all these other theories are now influencing modern people and their readers. So I think that, probably to argue from a modern point of view,